Blood on the tissue on the floor of the train. Sun goes down, temperature drops. Beautiful burnout, beautiful burnout. Bird, crone.
skinny thing. Naked around, naked around, naked around. Naked around the middle. She's a sleepwalker with an expensive bag, cruising cubicles, cash thrills, cruising in pink in a cap and hood. your black legs. Pig, 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 pig. Spit that word out at your best, mom. Remember, 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 remember it. All your Sundays come back to haunt me. I like to hurt myself like this sometimes. What you want from me this time? Do you want a spoon carrying another wound like a addiction when you caught your affliction? I'm in a rage, I'm in a rage, I'm in a rage. On you I refuse to hand it over. Burn me, burn me, burn me, burn me. I know what's gonna happen next. Stoop at the next table, touching the lips with love. Okay, now it's clean, you can look. Pink, green, and something chromium. Tattoo dad is getting dirty. In a tight thing. Off of your head, off of your head. You're a razor wire beauty. You're going straight, you're going straight, you're going straight. But sometimes you gotta show them. I like to hurt myself like this sometimes. What you want from me this time? Do you want a spoon carrying another wound like a addiction when you caught your affliction?